This is my video series on hunger in Appalachia and different discussions about it. I've had some requests for some longer form videos, so enjoy. Imagine a time in the early 1900s when thousands of people in the rural South and Appalachia were dying of a disease that could be cured with nutritious food and vitamins, and politicians refusing to acknowledge it existed and calling it fake news. That is something that really happened, and it was called pellagra. It is a disease that is caused by a lack of niacin or vitamin B3. When people aren't eating nutritious food that gives your body the vitamins that it needs, they can get sick. Pellagra, it caused rashes, weight loss, chronic diarrhea, dementia, death in the end. It hit rural communities the hardest. People who lived on very cheap food, who didn't have access to meat, who didn't have access to fresh vegetables and fresh foods, the ones who were relying on cornmeal, molasses, salt pork to survive, didn't have access to nutritional enough food, so their bodies were getting sick. And this was such a huge problem in the early 1900s. So this was a disease that didn't spread by germs, it was spread by poverty. In the early 1900s, 1/3 of deaths in some southern orphanages and meal towns was from pellagra. No one knew why at the time. They blamed spoiled corn. Others blamed bad blood or unclean living. Then there was a doctor who came out. His name was Joseph Goldberger, and he was sent by the U.S. Public Health Service in 1914 to figure it out. So he noticed something very strange in hospitals, that nurses and doctors were not getting this. They were caring for these patients, but they never caught, like nobody else ever caught it who was around them. So he decided to test a theory that if it's not contagious, maybe it's their diet. So he kind of did experiments at a prison farm in Mississippi. He fed volunteers a diet that mimicked what poor families in Appalachia and the Deep South were eating every day, mostly cornmeal, molasses, pork fat. And what he found was they developed pellagra. When their diets improved, they got better. So he had this scientific proof, but people, especially politicians and people in charge, they hated what it implied. If pellagra came from malnutrition, that meant that the South was starving its own people. Politicians got mad. There were politicians who called it slander. In Appalachia in general, the disease hit mining towns and rural families especially hard. Company stores only sold a few staples. Gardens failed. Fresh food was rare. People couldn't get meat. They couldn't get vegetables. People didn't think of it as malnutrition. They called it spring sickness, or they blamed curses. It was a vitamin deficiency. It was caused by economic systems that trapped families in poverty. Goldberger died in 1929 trying to still fight for this point, to fix this problem. But it wasn't until 1937 that scientists figured out that it was a niacin problem, that people were missing the nutrients they needed. So by the 1940s, mills began fortifying flour and cornmeal so that people were getting the nutrients they needed. The government stepped in at some point and started providing government rations of foods that were healthy to provide the nutrients people needed. So pellagra slowly disappeared as people started getting fed what they needed to be fed. So yes, people once died of vitamin deficiency while leaders called it fake news. The pellagra epidemic wasn't just a health crisis. It was a mirror showing how pride and denial can turn hunger into a slow, invisible death. And that is a lesson that is important today as it was back then. And I will keep talking about this in my next post. Thanks for watching. From the early 1900s to the 1940s, many Appalachian communities struggled with hunger. When people think of hunger, they imagine individual choices, skipping a meal, or budgeting poorly, or not working hard enough to earn the money needed to feed yourself. In Appalachia, that wasn't the case. Hunger wasn't a personal failure. It was built into the systems of society in the early 1900s. Communities in the mountains were isolated. Roads were rough. Grocery stores were scarce. Families relied on company stores or cheap staples to get them through the day. Fresh fruits and vegetables could be rare, especially in the colder months. People had to rely on canning and canned goods if they had the ability to do that. Fresh fruit and vegetables, they could be expensive or impossible to get if people were remote enough and isolated enough. Even when families were working long hours in the mills or the mines, they didn't always have enough money to buy food. So, economic systems at this time period made it worse. In mining towns, company stores only stocked what they wanted to sell, so they were in charge of determining people's diets. Farmers often didn't own enough land to grow a variety of crops, so people didn't necessarily have a variety of foods to give them the nutrition they need. Transportation and infrastructure kept good food out of reach for decades in many of the more isolated areas of the mountains. What people ate wasn't always what they wanted to eat, it was what they could afford or what was available. So, historical neglect played a huge role too. Public health programs and government relief efforts often bypassed rural Appalachian communities. Epidemics like pellagra in the 1910s and the 1920s often affected thousands and thousands of people, but local government leaders often ignored those people and left them in poverty and suffering. Hunger wasn't just a personal problem. It was the result of decades and decades of economic and political systems that failed the poorest people. Culture often blames victims. Families are told to eat better, make better choices, work harder so you can afford better food. But these suggestions are often ignoring reality. When the closest store sells mostly flour, molasses, salt pork, choices are extremely limited. Nutrition was a systemic problem, not an individual one, especially in the early 1900s. And in today's society, it is also systemic if you have like a lot of these rural, isolated areas in the mountain. It's a systemic problem when people don't have access to the food that they need to be healthy and to feed their families. So by the 1940s, programs like food fortification, public health campaigns, and improved governmental infrastructure around food and hunger, those things all changed things for the better in the mountains. But history shows that hunger in Appalachia it's not just a personal issue. It's not just people being lazy and not working hard enough. It is a societal issue shaped by the geography of the mountains, economics, what businesses are available, the neglect of the government on extremely rural communities. Hunger isn't always personal. Sometimes it is systemic, and understanding that changes how we think about the past and the present and how to help people in times when food insecurity is a really big issue. In 1917, an Appalachian newspaper dedicated an entire page to Meatless Mondays and discussing choosing your protein wisely. So at that time, it was wartime. The U.S. Food Administration told Americans to give up meat, sugar, and wheat so that more food could go overseas to soldiers. Families in Appalachia were often in poverty, so they were already living lean. They didn't need the government to tell them how to stretch a meal. They'd been doing it for many, many generations. The Tennessean ran a list of meatless ideas like dried beans, sweet potatoes, milk, and eggs. One recipe suggested sweet potato au gratin, which was baked with a little milk and a little cheese. It was something that people could cook when there was no meat. So, sociologically, if you look at stuff like this, meatless Mondays, or having meatless days and cooking without protein and choosing your proteins wisely so that you get enough nutrition, that shows how wartime patriotism and Appalachian poverty met together. So for wealthy families, meatless days were a sacrifice. But for mountain families, it was just a normal day of the week. These campaigns were to influence the nation to change their diets to feed soldiers overseas. But when you didn't have land or livestock to take part in this bigger picture. Like today, we have things like meatless Mondays because it's a luxury to be able to choose your own diet and to eat whatever you want. But back in the olden days of Appalachia, there was just poverty and people didn't have meat, period. By the 1940s, most areas of Appalachia had beaten the extreme levels of poverty and starvation of the early 1900s. By that time, flour was being fortified with vitamins, cornmeal too. You had families having gardens again. You had electricity in a lot of the rural areas where there wasn't electricity. So you had a lot of progress from the 1930s to the 1940s. But a few decades later, this problem would come back, and it would just be called different names. It was called pellagra in the early 1900s, but it was different later on. So when factories and coal mines started closing in the 1970s and the 1980s, entire Appalachian towns lost their economic backbones. Unemployment soared, grocery stores shut down, and cheap processed food just flooded in. People weren't dying of pellagra anymore, but they were still dying of the same root cause: poverty shaping what people eat. So by the 1980s, researchers were noticing something strange. Malnutrition and obesity were rising at the same time. Families who were once fighting off vitamin deficiencies were now living off of boxed dinners and instant noodles and foods full of calories but empty of nutrients. So it's a modern version of the same old problem. During the pellagra era, people ate too much cornmeal and not enough variety, so they weren't getting the nutrition that they needed because they didn't have the foods available that they needed to be healthy. But now, in the 1970s, 1980s, and even today, people are eating too much processed foods. They're eating corn syrup, not enough real food. So you have different health problems arising. So you have obesity, you have diabetes, you have autoimmune conditions. It's a different generation, but it's the same kind of imbalance in terms of the food that we eat. Federal programs like WIC and food stamps help many families to survive, but access to fresh produce and quality groceries, it still stays unequal. In some Appalachian counties today, people still drive 30 or 40 minutes to reach a supermarket. Where I live, our grocery store just shut down. So we have a Dollar General, and we don't have access to fresh meat. We don't have access to fresh vegetables. We have to drive probably like 45 minutes in either direction to get to civilization, to get to grocery stores. And if you don't have good vehicles or any way to get there, you don't have any way to have access to these foods. So that is how food deserts form. That is how hunger hides in plain sight. People have enough to eat, but they're still malnourished. Heart disease, diabetes, nutrient deficiencies, autoimmune conditions, all of these different conditions that people have today related to our diets. It's replaced pellagra on death certificates, but it's the same story. When economy collapses, health collapses with it. So yes, Appalachia did beat pellagra, but the region still lives with the same thing, just in new forms. Every time a family relies on processed foods because it's all they can afford, it is a quiet echo of that same thing that happened to us in the past. No one really wins the fight against malnutrition. No one really wins the fight against malnutrition until the system that creates the chain is broken. So that is something that we can learn from pellagra in the early 1900s, and history repeats itself. It might look different, we might use different words, but history repeats itself, and we really need to learn our lessons so that it doesn't happen again. Soup, beans, and cornbread are one of the most beloved meals in Appalachian mountains. What if the history behind that simple plate of comfort food lies the deadliest disease in Appalachian history, and it wasn't contagious? It was poverty itself. In the early 1900s, mountain families started to suffer from a strange sickness. Their skin burned and blistered in the sun. Their minds grew foggy. Their stomachs turned against them, and they slowly started to waste away. Doctors called it pellagra. Locals called it the plague of the poor. At first, they blamed musty corn, the kind that was stored all winter and could have gotten damp. But the truth was deeper than that. people weren't dying of bad corn. They were dying from a system that left them nothing else to eat. Most Appalachian households survived on cornmeal, lard, molasses. Meat was a luxury, but not everybody had access to fresh vegetables, especially in the colder months. And poverty meant there was no way to buy better food. What scientists eventually learned was that corn doesn't provide enough niacin, enough vitamin B3, unless it is processed a certain way. Without it, the body and the brain start to collapse. So in the mountains, pellagra spread not through infection, but through inequality. In mining towns in the Tennessee Valley, even in isolated ridge farms, thousands suffered quietly while outsiders blamed superstitions, laziness, or ignorance. But this wasn't a story of ignorance. It was a story of survival under constraints. Sociologically, pellagra shows us how poverty becomes biological, how inequality seeps into the body itself. When we say Appalachia was sick back then, what we really mean is that people were starving and getting so sick from the foods that they had because they were not nutritionally healthy for them and they were not providing for their bodies. And it wasn't just Appalachia, it was the South in general. Poverty was so bad in so many places that the government eventually had to step in. And that is when the government started to provide rations of food that would help people to be nutritionally healthier. So if you've ever heard of government cheese, that's one of them. But they also had government beans. And government beans being provided to the people of Appalachia eventually became one of the most beloved dishes, soup, beans, and cornbread. So I'll talk about this more in another post because it's a very interesting history. And if you look at newspapers from that time period, there were a lot of places that denied that this issue really existed, that people were starving to death. They wanted to refuse like government programs to help people, but I'll talk about that in another post on another day.